Welcome to a brand new episode of Extreme Reloading. Today we're asking, what effect does neck wall thickness have on the precision of our ammunition? Now, on to today's topic. Let's talk about neck wall thickness. And really this is all related to neck tension. Big topic. We've talked about it, well, now this season. We talked about it in past seasons for several years, and we've dealt with it. We've done some different experiments, and we're going to be dealing with it again in a little bit different way this season. Let's begin by looking at the factors that affect neck tension. And obviously one of those factors I've already mentioned is neck wall thickness. Another one of those factors is the length of the neck, or its total bearing surface, the interior surface condition of the neck, which actually we did a little experiment on that in the last episode of Extreme Reloading, where we looked at and used a standard untreated case mouth or case neck. We used a nice scrubbed inside of the case neck, and we also used mica to treat the case neck. If you didn't catch that video, the link for that video will be available, or is available, in the description. You can kind of catch up on that. But some other factors that still and also affect neck tension is the ductility of the brass. In other words, the softness of the brass. And of course, we can affect that through our annealing processes. And we did a big experiment this season on annealing. A couple of other factors include bullet seating depth, time between loading and firing. I've never tested that, but I could see how potentially that could have an effect, especially if there is years between loading and firing. And there's also the effect based on the bullet jacket. Here we have a pretty much standard bullet, lead core bullet, Sierra tipped Match King, my 1/68 that I use tremendously, and comparing that to the Barnes bullet right over here. This is a tipped triple shock bullet. This is not a jacketed bullet. This is a solid copper bullet. And so that construction of the bullet itself can also affect neck tension. And one thing we cannot overlook is the fact that that round that we are loading is going to be placed into a very specific chamber of a rifle, and the characteristics of that particular chamber also play a role, just like all the other factors I've already listed. And that's what we call chamber clearance. You know, if we have a chamber that is prepared as a .308 Winchester chamber, if it was possible for all of us to make absolutely fine measurements of exactly the dimensions of that chamber, and on my Ruger precision rifle, I was able to compare those chamber measurements with your .308 Winchester chamber measurements and your .308 Winchester chamber measurements, we would see differences. Oh, they wouldn't be gigantic differences, but there would be differences. Just like all the other factors we just talked about, there are differences. In fact, I could take a couple of .308s that we have here and shoot the same round in it, and there's going to be differences, maybe for lots of reasons, but don't overlook chamber clearance. Now, if we're going to focus on a specific round, let's say that .308 Winchester, then a couple of these factors kind of become a constant. For instance, the length of the neck. As long as we have prepared the case properly and it remains within SAMI specs, we've trimmed the case, treated that case mouth, properly, very consistently, then that whole length of the case neck becomes a constant and no longer a varying factor. If we have properly annealed our case, then the ductility of the brass begins to play a very, very small role in those general factors. And if we're loading the Sierra-tipped Match King, or we're loading the Barnes-tipped triple shock, then that bullet itself becomes a very, very minimal factor in the overall neck tension equation. Yes, there can be some variation in this particular bullet, but very, very, very minor. Probably can be considered nil, next to nothing. So, with all other things being considered equal, what really is left to change? Well, one of the things that certainly can change is that neck wall thickness. And we can modify neck wall thickness by turning the necks. And I've done a couple of videos on turning necks. And it's not a terribly difficult process. And for a couple of years now, when I started this a number of years ago, a couple of years now, I've been wondering, is it really necessary? Am I really improving my rounds by turning the necks? Or am I actually hurting the precision of my rounds? And so in this video, what I want to do is I want to really ask that, or I really want to answer that question. And so what I have is I have a bunch of Federal Champion brass, premium brass over here. This has been annealed, been very, very carefully taken care of. And this brass, I went through when I sorted it down to be as exact as possible in each of these. And I only ended up with 5 or 6 cases that have been neck turned, and otherwise everything is exactly the same, and another 5 or 6 cases that have not been neck turned. The weight of the case before neck turning was from the same batch. In other words, the individual brass cases varied by less than 1 grain. And specifically, the neck turned brass has a weight of 176.1 to 176.7 grains. The outside diameter of these brass cases is 0.335 of an inch. The standard brass cases I'll be using have a weight of 175.8 to 176.8, so they vary by up to a grain in weight. Very, very low variability though. And they also have an outside diameter of 0.335 of an inch. Now, where these two sets of brass deviate or differ is in their uniformity of those case neck thicknesses. The cases that I have neck turned vary by only and up to only 1/1000th of an inch. The cases that I did not neck turn vary by up to 3/1000ths. In fact, 2 to 3/1000ths of an inch. So my real question is, does this variability in case neck thickness affect precision? And it's going to be really interesting. We're going to go ahead and monitor the neck tension as we proceed through the loading process. And I'm going to try to get my cartridge-based ogive to be as consistent as possible, trying to hit that 2.063 plus or minus maybe 1/1000th or so. We'll keep that as consistent as possible. And we're going to head out to the range and we're going to shoot these 2 separate sets. Now, I'm only going to be shooting 5 rounds of my standard, let's say, loading again, and 5 rounds of the neck turned. And what I'm curious about is if we see any difference whatsoever. We may not, and with this experiment with only 5 rounds, 1 group being fired for each type, we're not going to be able to definitively answer the question, but I hope it points us in the right direction and gives us a hint about how important neck tension, I should say how important neck turning is in the overall precision rifle process. And you know, the one thing I'm thinking about is that this is a production rifle, Ruger precision rifle, and as I use this more and more and more, I'm suspecting that that chamber is a little bit, or it's kind of a generous chamber based on how I've been watching the brass that comes out of it, measuring the brass. So this may be a very, very different result than others may see when they have a custom barrel with a custom chambering, and in some cases you have to turn those necks down, in other words, just to make for some safe ammunition to shoot. So this is results very specific to my rifle, my loading, and this particular brass, this particular bullet that I'm using. But I think it's going to give us some insight into this whole question of neck turning. So stick with me. I'm going to start reloading. We're going to head out to the range and then come back in and take a look at our results. Starting with the neck turned rounds, 5 rounds, upper left bullseye. Flew very high, right to the top of the target. That one flew a little bit to the right, but it wasn't me. Felt great on the trigger. Felt nice. 5 more rounds. This is my, I'll call it my standard loading. Talked all about it before we came out here. You know, really, the only difference between these two groups that I'm firing, literally just about the only difference at all, is in the consistency of the neck wall thickness. Down to, again, 1/1000th of an inch, actually a little bit less than 1/1000th of an inch for the group I just shot, and 2 to 3/1000ths of an inch variability in neck wall thickness for this group. Let's go see if it even makes a difference. Now I dropped her down 6 clicks, so I should be, down 1 inch and half. That should put us much closer to a bullseye. Yeah, that's closer to bullseye. On drat. I didn't pull it. It shot high. But that's cool. It's looking good downrange. From what I can see right here, I'll call it, it doesn't make any difference. And if anything, what I'm calling my standard load would be favored. It looks like the first 3 shots went almost through the same hole. Then one shot forth, dead in the bullseye. My last shot high, off to about 10, 11 o'clock. Let's take a look at these targets, these bullseyes that we just shot. First group, you will recall, was the neck turned, very highly uniform neck wall thicknesses, and it gave us a 5-shot group with 1.35 MOA. 100 yards, that's not great. That's not very good, especially out of a precision rifle. Second group, standard Nothing was done special to those necks whatsoever. Highly consistent brass in all other ways. In fact, identical types of brass. This one, 1.17 MOA. Now, a lot of folks would take a look at this and say 1.35 MOA versus 1.17 MOA. There's clearly a difference. I've heard this before. There's clearly a difference. Well, I will argue with that. There's not clearly a difference, because what we have to do is we have to look at this statistically. This is two samples from what we would call a population of all different sorts of 168 grain Sierra tipped Match King loads that I have fired through this Ruger precision rifle. All different sorts of experiments. Some of those are not comparable to this, but nonetheless we have this population of all different sorts of groups that have been shot. And when we look at these two groups amongst the larger population that we're still shooting, by the way, but the larger sample of the population, which is now getting close to about 70 groups, then what we see is these two groups fit perfectly within the bounds, the variability of the existing groups. In other words, they're not different. They're not different from one another. They're not different from that whole population. It's simply part of that population. And that's the dangerous part that I see a lot of folks doing. I always try to refrain from this myself, and that is jumping to conclusions. We have this test, we have that test, just one little test comparing two different treatments, let's say, and we're very quick to jump to conclusions. Oh, those numbers are different, therefore this treatment works better than that treatment. Well, as we saw with the annealing experiment, one of those sessions when I was out on the range, it looked clearly like the unannealed or non-annealed brass worked better. But then later, oh, it clearly looks like the annealed brass worked better. And it kind of went back and forth throughout the entire session. And numerous weeks we did covering that entire series. And in the end, we saw that all of those rounds actually were absolutely indiscernible or non-discernible from one another. They are part of the same population. And what we're seeing here again is that there's really no statistical or discernible difference between these two groups. Now I will note that my sample of the population, those 65, almost probably about 70 groups of the 168 grain Sierra tipped Match King that I've been shooting over the years, those results are, fairly broad. I'll give it that. And so it's pretty easy for a lot of these new groups to fit within that population. And the reason why it's pretty broad is because it includes a lot of my experiments that didn't work out so well. Perhaps this is one of those where the uniformed neck wall thicknesses shot poorly, we would say, in contrast to the standard neck wall thicknesses or neck preparations. And perhaps if I could go through all of my records and be absolutely sure that this was an experiment gone bad, this is normal, and so on and so forth, then that variability, high MOA and lowest MOA, would probably shrink. But it's really hard to do that, because how do you call something an experiment gone awry if you don't test it statistically against what else has been happening? So it is what it is once again, and this is what we have. But now there's a couple of other things we need to look at. We did a measurement of extreme spread measured in MOA, and we have one number compared to another number. Remember earlier in this season of extreme reloading, we also talked about another way to measure those groups, and that is the mean radius, or what we call the distance to centroid. Now that gives us 5 measurements for each of these groups. Each of the individual rounds becomes a measurement. And what we see is that the neck-turned group has 2 possible outliers identified in it, or for it, based on the distance to centroid, whereas this one here, the standard group, has only 1 round that would be considered a possible outlier using that analysis. Now, it may seem counterintuitive that a highly consistent piece of brass with neck wall thicknesses that varied by less than 1/1000th of an inch shot worse than standard brass that was less consistent. Neck wall thicknesses varied by 2 to 3 thousandths of an inch. Not up to 3 thousandths of an inch, no, they varied between 2 thousandths and 3 thousandths of an inch. So that certainly does seem counterintuitive. But here is where we need to start thinking about the rifle. The rifle's chamber, the chamber spec, and what we talked about earlier, chamber clearance. And what I'm thinking is that this Ruger precision rifle has just a standard factory production barrel on it. I don't know the exact chamber specs on it, but what I can almost certainly guarantee is that the chamber specs of this particular rifle, even though they're going to meet SAMI specifications, they're going to be different than if I were using a custom barrel with a customized throat and very precise chamber specs. That is going to be a different type of barrel. In fact, the quality of the barrel is probably going to be quite a bit different. Now, the Ruger barrels, by the way, are cold hammer forged barrels, which is a very good way of making those barrels and making the rifling. But apart from that, I'm thinking that the type of shooting that I'm trying to do and the type of improvements that I'm trying to do, I very likely I may have arrived at a plateau for this particular rifle, and some of the much more extreme things I'm trying to do may not be an advantage whatsoever, may not make much of a difference. Of course, once again, I should be shooting more groups to be absolutely certain of this, and I will be shooting more groups. I've got quite a bit of neck-turned brass here at my disposal, and I will continue doing some more of these experiments. Let's take a look now at the chronograph results, and this is important also. We need to have good, consistent muzzle velocities if we're going to expect good and consistent groups, group after group after group, especially if we start shooting longer ranges, 3, 4, 5, 600 yards out there. That's really where the very, very tight standard deviation of the muzzle velocity starts to play a larger role in group size. So we really didn't do that good. In fact, the average muzzle velocity for the neck-turned brass was 2,554 feet per second with a standard deviation of 14.4 feet per second. That's not too bad. Didn't make it into the single digits, but we're in the teens, so that's okay. There was one, however, that was quite different. I noticed that as I was shooting and kind of glancing up at that lab radar, and if I eliminate that, then our average muzzle velocity becomes 2,549 feet per second with a standard deviation dropping to 11 feet per second. Now the standard deviation of muzzle velocities on the standard brass was 2,538 feet per second, fairly slower it looks like than the neck-turned brass, and that's interesting, with a standard deviation that's quite high, 25 feet per second. But one of those rounds I noticed again as I was shooting and took a very close look at it when I downloaded those results to my computer. One was really, really slow, just one. When I then eliminate that one really slow round, recalc things, we now have an average muzzle velocity of 2,547 feet per second, standard deviation of 11 feet per second. And now if we compare the average muzzle velocity of those two groups, they're almost identical. 2,547 standard, 2,549 for the neck-turned brass. So, should you be neck-turning your cases, or at least flattening the hills, removing the imperfections, and making those case neck thicknesses a little bit more uniform? I'm not going to say no. I'm going to say it depends upon your rifle. If your rifle can take advantage of cases prepared in such a way, and if they respond favorably to that, then certainly go ahead and do it. I'm not done yet. I'm going to take a closer look at this and keep shooting and making some tests over time. But right now, it doesn't look for me like, oh, I really have to do that. That's the only way I'm going to get consistent sub-MOA accuracy. No, that's not what I'm seeing. And so if you're shooting a standard Ruger, Remington, whatever barrel, you may not see any advantage to it whatsoever. Well, I hope this video gave you something to think about. I hope you enjoyed it also. If you've got some questions or ideas, feel free to post those in the comments. We'll probably have a nice discussion about that. And once again, thank you for watching.